You people need to learn your place." The words sliced through the morning chaos of LAX Terminal 6 like a blade through silk, carrying enough venom to poison the recycled airport air around Gate B47. Maya Williams felt the familiar sting of those two words, "you people," as they landed on her like physical blows, each syllable designed to remind her that no matter how much money was in her bank account, no matter how many platinum frequent flyer cards were tucked into her designer wallet, there would always be someone ready to tell her she didn't belong. Standing beside her sister Zara at the Horizon Airways first-class check-in counter, Maya adjusted the strap of her limited edition Hermes carry-on bag and took a slow, deliberate breath that tasted of jet fuel and bitter coffee, the signature cocktail of early morning airports where dreams took flight and prejudices crash-landed. The twins were 19, identical in everything except the small scar above Zara's left eyebrow from a childhood accident, both carrying themselves with the fluid confidence that comes from a lifetime of international travel. Private jets and boardroom meetings, where their father's voice carried the weight to move mountains and ground airplanes. To anyone with a trained eye for luxury, the signs were everywhere, like a constellation of wealth scattered across their understated appearance. The simple hoodies they wore cost more than most people's monthly rent, crafted from Mongolian cashmere, so soft it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their matching joggers bore the subtle V-stitching that marked them as Valentino, and the hardware on their rolling luggage was rose gold, not the standard chrome that came with ordinary travel bags. Even their sneakers, which looked casual enough for a college campus, were custom Balenciaga numbered editions that required a 6-month waiting list and connections that money alone couldn't buy. But Linda Morrison, the senior gate agent, who had been standing guard over the first-class counter for 24 years, like a dragon protecting a hoard of gold-rimmed boarding passes, didn't have a trained eye for anything except her own sense of superiority and the bitter satisfaction that came from denying access to people she deemed unworthy. Her polyester Horizon Airways uniform was pressed so severely that the creases looked sharp enough to cut paper, and her silk scarf was knotted around her neck with military precision, creating a barrier between her pale, foundation-caked skin and the world that had disappointed her in countless small ways over the decades. The fluorescent lighting above cast harsh shadows across Linda's face, emphasizing the deep lines that had formed around her mouth from years of pursing her lips in disapproval at passengers who didn't meet her arbitrary standards of respectability. Her nameplate pinned to her chest like a badge of honor read, Linda M. Service Excellence Award, 2018. A piece of recognition that she wore as both a shield and a weapon proof, that her methods worked and her judgment was sound, even when that judgment was clouded by assumptions that had no basis in reality. The morning rush at LAX was building to its usual crescendo of controlled chaos, with travelers dragging wheeled luggage across polished floors that reflected the anxious faces of people running late for connections, business meetings, and family reunions. The air conditioning hummed overhead like a mechanical heartbeat, pushing around air that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner, and the faint ozone scent that airports seemed to generate naturally, a combination of electronics, exhaust fumes, and the collective stress of thousands of people trying to get somewhere else as quickly as possible. Maya and Zara had navigated this chaos countless times before moving through airports with the practiced ease of seasoned diplomats, but today felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm clouds gathering outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the departure gates. They had learned early in life that traveling while black required an extra layer of preparation, an additional mental armor that white passengers never had to consider, and today they could feel that familiar weight settling on their shoulders like an invisible cloak. The check-in area for first-class passengers was separated from the general boarding zones by velvet ropes and brass stanchions, creating a physical barrier that was as much about psychology as it was about crowd control. A visual reminder that not all passengers were created equal, and that access to certain spaces required more than just money. It required acceptance from the gatekeepers who controlled the golden tickets to comfort and convenience people like Linda Morrison, who had turned customer service into a form of social engineering, deciding who belonged and who didn't, based on criteria that had nothing to do with ticket prices or loyalty status. Linda Morrison had been working at LAX since the Clinton administration, back when airport security meant walking through a metal detector without removing your shoes, and when customer service was still considered a noble profession rather than a necessary evil. 24 years of dealing with entitled passengers, rude travelers, and corporate restructuring had worn her down like ocean waves against a cliff face, leaving behind someone who was harder, more bitter, and significantly more suspicious of anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of what a first-class passenger should look like. She had started her career with genuine enthusiasm, believing that helping people reach their destinations was a form of public service. But decades of thankless work, stagnant wages, and watching younger, less experienced employees get promoted over her had turned that enthusiasm into resentment. The power she wielded over boarding passes and gate access had become her primary source of satisfaction in life, the one area where she could exercise control in a world that seemed determined to leave her behind. Her apartment in Inglewood was small and cluttered with airline memorabilia from the days when flying was still glamorous, when passengers dressed up for flights and flight attendants were considered celebrities. She lived alone with 2 cats who ignored her as completely as her supervisors did, and her social life consisted mainly of complaining to other gate agents about the decline of common courtesy and the deterioration of proper travel etiquette. In her mind, she wasn't discriminating against anyone. She was simply maintaining standards that other people were too weak or too politically correct to enforce. The twins approaching her counter triggered every alarm bell in Linda's Prejudice-calibrated security system, from their youthful faces to their street-style clothing to the confident way they moved through a space that she considered her personal domain. She saw 2 young black women who couldn't possibly afford the tickets they claimed to have, couldn't possibly belong in the rarefied air of first-class service, and couldn't possibly deserve the level of respect and attention that she reserved for her legitimate passengers. Derek Hamilton arrived at the gate area like a corporate superhero, responding to a distress signal, his Horizon Airways management badge swinging from a retractable cord clipped to his belt like a weapon in a holster. At 28 years old, Derek had parlayed a business administration degree from a mid-tier state university and his father's golf club connections into a duty manager position that he treated like preparation for his inevitable ascension to the executive suite. He wore his authority like an expensive cologne, heavy and obvious, making sure everyone around him knew exactly who was in charge. His navy blue suit was tailored just tight enough to show off the physique he maintained through twice-weekly personal training sessions, and his hair was styled with the kind of precision that required daily maintenance and weekly touch-ups. Derek had never met a mirror he didn't like, and he approached every workplace interaction as an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership potential to the senior executives who would eventually recognize his talents and promote him to the corner office he believed he deserved. The morning heat was already building outside the terminal, and the air conditioning was struggling to keep pace with the greenhouse effect created by acres of glass windows and thousands of warm bodies moving through the concourses. The combination of rising temperatures and mounting pressure from delayed flights was creating the perfect storm for confrontation, and Derek could sense the tension in the air like a predator smelling blood in the water. He had been monitoring radio chatter from the various gate agents under his supervision when Linda's voice crackled through his earpiece with the special tone she reserved for situations that required management intervention. Derek lived for these moments, opportunities to demonstrate his authority and solve problems with the kind of decisive action that would look good on his quarterly performance reviews. He straightened his tie, checked his reflection in his phone screen, and strode toward Gate B47 with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his entire privileged life. The first-class check-in counter was Linda's kingdom, and she ruled it with the iron fist of someone who had been given a small amount of power and intended to use every bit of it. The computer terminal in front of her displayed flight manifests, passenger information, and booking details, but she rarely consulted it when making decisions about who deserved her assistance and who needed to be redirected to the appropriate queue for people of their obvious social status. Maya pulled out her phone with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had learned to document everything, holding it steady as she navigated to the Horizon Airways app, where their boarding passes were stored in digital perfection, complete with the golden border that indicated titanium elite status and the seat assignments that clearly showed 1A and 1B, the most coveted positions in the aircraft's nose section. The screen displayed their confirmation numbers, flight details, and the kind of detailed itinerary information that could only come from legitimate bookings purchased with real money. "Ma'am, if you could please scan our boarding passes, we'd really appreciate it," Maya said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had learned to remain calm in situations where other people lost their composure, though anyone listening carefully could hear the slight tension underneath, like a violin string that had been tuned just a quarter turn too tight. She held the phone toward Linda's scanner close enough that the older woman couldn't claim she couldn't see the screen, but not so close as to be threatening or aggressive. Linda didn't even glance at the device, instead keeping her eyes focused on some invisible point beyond Maya's left shoulder, as if acknowledging the phone's existence would somehow legitimize what she had already decided was an elaborate fraud. Her fingers drummed against the counter with the irritating rhythm of someone who was enjoying the power dynamic more than the actual work. And when she finally spoke, her words came out clipped and sharp, like ice cubes hitting the bottom of a glass. "I don't need to scan anything to know that you girls are in the wrong line," Linda announced, her voice loud enough to carry to the passengers forming behind the twins, creating an audience for the humiliation she was about to deliver with the expertise of someone who had perfected the art of public shaming over decades of practice. First-class passengers don't dress like they're headed to a basketball game, and they certainly don't travel in groups trying to sneak past security with fake boarding passes downloaded from some TikTok tutorial. The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke spreading through the gate area and poisoning the atmosphere with its casual cruelty and confident ignorance. Zara felt her jaw clench involuntarily, a physical response to words that were designed to wound and diminish, but she forced herself to maintain the composure that their father had taught them was their greatest weapon against people who wanted to see them lose control and prove their prejudices correct. "We're not trying to sneak anywhere," Zara replied, her voice steady, despite the anger building in her chest like steam in a pressure cooker, each word carefully chosen to avoid giving Linda any ammunition to use against them. "We purchased these tickets with our own money, and we have every right to be in this line and board this aircraft." She gestured toward the boarding pass display on Maya's phone, where the Horizon Airways logo gleamed next to their names and seat assignments in font that was large enough for even Linda's tired eyes to read clearly. The businessman, standing third in line, a silver-haired executive in a charcoal suit who had been checking his Rolex with increasing frequency, cleared his throat loudly and stepped closer to the counter, his impatience radiating from him like heat from hot pavement. "Excuse me, but some of us have connections to make," he announced, his voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who was accustomed to having his schedule take priority over everyone else's problems. "Could we please move this along and get these, issues sorted out somewhere else?" Linda's face immediately transformed into a mask of professional servility, her scowl melting away like snow in sunshine as she turned to address the man she recognized as belonging to her preferred category of passenger, someone whose appearance and attitude matched her expectations for first-class service. "Of course, Mr. Henderson," she said, having read his name from the boarding pass he held in his manicured hand. "I'm so sorry for this delay, but as I'm sure you understand, we have to be very careful about security and make sure everyone is exactly where they're supposed to be." The coded language was as clear as if Linda had shouted her intentions through a megaphone, creating a verbal barrier between the legitimate passengers like Mr. Henderson and the suspicious individuals she was obviously trying to protect him from, people like Maya and Zara, who had somehow infiltrated a space where they clearly didn't belong and needed to be removed before their presence contaminated the refined atmosphere that first-class passengers paid premium prices to experience. Derek arrived at the counter like cavalry responding to a distress signal, his footsteps sharp against the polished floor and his radio crackling with the static of important communications that only management personnel were qualified to interpret and respond to properly. He had been watching the situation unfold from his position near the departure board, and his supervisor's instincts told him that this was exactly the kind of problem that required swift, decisive action to prevent escalation and maintain the smooth operation of his assigned gate area. "Ladies," Derek announced, his voice carrying the full authority of his position and his absolute confidence in his ability to resolve any situation through the application of proper procedures and uncompromising adherence to airline policies. "I'm going to need you to step aside and allow me to speak with our agent here about what seems to be some confusion regarding your travel arrangements." His smile was professionally warm, but didn't reach his eyes, which were already calculating the most efficient way to remove this obstacle to normal operations. Maya and Zara exchanged a look that contained entire conversations, years of shared experiences with people who looked at them and saw problems to be solved, rather than human beings to be respected. Decades of learning to recognize the difference between genuine confusion and deliberate humiliation, and the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that came from constantly having to prove their right to exist in spaces where their presence was questioned, challenged, and ultimately rejected by people who had appointed themselves as the guardians of institutional bias. Derek stepped behind Linda's terminal and began typing with the aggressive enthusiasm of someone who was absolutely certain that he was about to expose a fraud so obvious that everyone watching would applaud his detective skills and recommend him for immediate promotion to a position with significantly more authority and a much better parking space. His fingers hammered the keyboard as he pulled up the passenger manifest for Flight 882, scrolling through the alphabetical listing until he found what he was looking for, or rather, what he was certain he wouldn't find, because in Derek's limited experience, young black women in casual clothing simply didn't purchase first-class tickets on their own. "Williams." "Maya and Zara," he read from the screen, his voice dropping an octave as the reality of the booking information began to penetrate the wall of assumptions he had built around this situation. The computer displayed everything exactly as the twins had claimed. First-class seats 1A and 1B, full-fare tickets purchased 3 weeks earlier, titanium elite status confirmed, and a VIP designation that usually indicated passengers who required special attention due to their importance or influence, rather than their potential to cause problems. Derek's confidence faltered for exactly 3 seconds before his prejudice protection system kicked into overdrive, generating alternative explanations that would allow him to maintain his worldview while still addressing the uncomfortable evidence staring at him from the monitor. "Look, I see the reservation," he said, turning away from the screen to address Maya and Zara with the patronizing tone of someone explaining a complex concept to small children. "But I also see some irregularities that trigger our fraud detection protocols, which means I'm required to cancel these bookings immediately and refer the matter to our security department for further investigation." Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach, a familiar sensation that she had learned to recognize as the moment when polite requests and reasonable explanations stopped being effective and more direct action became necessary. She reached into her hoodie pocket and withdrew a device that made Derek's eyes narrow with confusion and concern, because instead of the standard iPhone or Samsung Galaxy that he had been expecting, Maya was holding a satellite phone that looked like it belonged in a military command center or a corporate boardroom where decisions affecting millions of people were made with casual conversations. The satellite phone was matte black with an antenna that extended with a soft telescoping sound, and its screen displayed not the colorful icons of social media apps, but the stark functional interface of encrypted communications technology that cost more than Derek's annual salary and required the kind of security clearances that weren't available to ordinary civilians. Maya's thumb moved to a speed dial button marked with the number 1, and she pressed it without hesitation, her eyes never leaving Derek's face as the connection was established with the kind of crystal-clear audio quality that only government-grade equipment could provide. "Hello, Daddy," Maya said into the device, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence that had fallen over the gate area as passengers and staff alike realized that something significant was happening. Something that went beyond the usual airport drama of overbooked flights and missed connections. "We're at LAX Gate B47 and we're having some trouble with Horizon Airways staff who seem to think our tickets are fraudulent and our presence here is inappropriate." Derek's face went through a rapid series of expressions from confusion to condescension to the beginning edges of something that might have been concern, though he was still operating under the assumption that Maya was calling a family member who might have some minor influence with the airline, or possibly a lawyer who could file a complaint that would be promptly ignored by Horizon's legal department. He crossed his arms over his chest and prepared to explain to whoever was on the other end of the line that airport security and fraud prevention were serious matters that couldn't be resolved through emotional appeals or threats of legal action. "Yes, the duty manager just canceled our tickets." Maya continued holding Derek's gaze while she spoke her words, creating a real-time record of his actions that was being transmitted directly to someone whose response would determine how this situation would unfold over the next several hours. "His name is Derek Hamilton, and he's standing right here looking very confident about his decision to void our boarding passes and flag our identification for security review." The voice that emerged from the satellite phone's speaker was deep authoritative and carried the kind of weight that made conference rooms fall silent and stock prices fluctuate based on nothing more than tone and inflection. Victor Williams spoke with the measured cadence of someone who was accustomed to being listened to when he talked, and whose words had the power to reshape entire industries through the simple expedient of withdrawing his cooperation from the complex web of contracts and relationships that kept the modern world functioning smoothly. "Put me on speaker," Victor instructed, his voice carrying clearly, despite the fact that he was speaking from his office in downtown Los Angeles 40 miles away, but connected to this moment through technology that made distance irrelevant and allowed his influence to reach across space and time to touch the lives of people who had made the mistake of disrespecting his children. Maya pressed a button, and suddenly Victor Williams was present in the gate area as surely as if he had walked through the security checkpoint and demanded to speak with everyone involved in this rapidly escalating situation. "Mr. Hamilton." Victor's voice filled the space around the first-class counter, causing nearby passengers to stop their conversations and focus their attention on what was clearly becoming a confrontation of unusual significance. "My daughters tell me that you've accused them of fraud, canceled their legally purchased tickets, and flagged their identification as suspicious, all without bothering to verify the accuracy of your assumptions or consider the consequences of your actions." Derek felt his mouth go dry as his brain finally began to process the implications of what was happening, because the voice speaking to him through Maya's satellite phone carried a level of authority that he had only heard during corporate conference calls when the real decision-makers were involved, people whose names appeared on the company directory several levels above his own supervisor's supervisor. "Sir, I was just following standard procedures for suspicious bookings," Derek managed to say, though his voice cracked slightly as he realized that he might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. "My name is Victor Williams," the voice from the phone announced with the kind of calm that preceded devastating action, CEO and chairman of Titan Energy Solutions. "And before you make your next statement, Mr. Hamilton, I want you to understand exactly who you're dealing with and what you've just set in motion by treating my daughters like criminals instead of the paying customers they are. The name Titan Energy Solutions hit Derek's consciousness like a physical blow because anyone who worked in the aviation industry knew that Titan wasn't just another fuel supplier. They were the fuel supplier controlling more than 60% of the jet fuel distribution on the West Coast and holding contracts with every major airline that operated out of LAX, including Horizon Airways, whose aircraft couldn't taxi to the runway without Victor Williams' permission and cooperation. Derek's face underwent a transformation that was visible to everyone, watching the color draining from his skin so rapidly that he looked like he was experiencing some sort of medical emergency, his confident posture collapsing as the full magnitude of his mistake began to register in his nervous system like seismic shocks from an earthquake that was about to level everything he thought he knew about power and consequences. His hands started trembling as he realized that he hadn't just insulted two passengers, he had declared war on the man who controlled the fuel that kept Horizon Airways' entire operation running. "Sir, I didn't know." Derek stammered, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the terminal, but Victor Williams wasn't interested in apologies or explanations because the time for reasonable conversation had passed the moment his daughters were treated like suspected criminals rather than valued customers who deserved the respect that their loyalty and spending power had earned them. Mr. Hamilton Victor's voice continued with the measured tone of someone delivering a diagnosis of terminal illness. "Since you've determined that my daughters are not qualified to fly on Horizon Airways, I've determined that Horizon Airways is not qualified to purchase fuel from Titan Energy Solutions, effective immediately." The words carried across the gate area like ripples from a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward and touching every conversation and every awareness until the entire space was focused on the implications of what had just been announced. Through the massive windows that formed the outer wall of the terminal, passengers and staff could see the yellow and blue Titan Energy fuel trucks that had been servicing aircraft along the entire concourse. And as Victor Williams spoke, those trucks began a choreographed withdrawal that looked like a military retreat, with drivers disconnecting fuel lines, retracting hoses, and climbing into their cabs, with the synchronized precision of people following orders that had been issued from the highest levels of their organization. The lead fuel truck disconnected from Horizon Airways Flight 882 with a sharp pneumatic hiss that cut through the terminal noise like a warning siren, and the driver gave a casual wave to the ground crew before putting his vehicle in gear and rolling away from the gate, leaving the Boeing 737 sitting on the tarmac like a beached whale, powerful but powerless, without the fuel that would allow its engines to transform potential energy into the kinetic force needed to defy gravity and carry its passengers to their intended destination. Linda Morrison watched the fuel truck disappear around the corner of the terminal building and felt something cold and unpleasant beginning to form in her stomach because in 24 years of working at LAX, she had never seen a fuel truck simply drive away from an aircraft that was scheduled for departure, and she was beginning to understand that this situation had escalated beyond her ability to control or comprehend. Derek grabbed the radio from his belt and keyed the microphone with fingers that were shaking so badly he could barely manage to press the button. His voice cracking as he tried to reach the operations center and get some kind of official guidance on how to handle a crisis that wasn't covered in any training manual or employee handbook he had ever read. "Operations. This is Hamilton at Gate B47. Derek transmitted his words, coming out in a rush as he tried to compress the enormity of his situation into a radio call that wouldn't sound completely insane to whoever was monitoring the frequency. "We have a situation with fuel services, and I need immediate supervisor support and probably some kind of legal guidance because I think I may have just triggered some kind of contract dispute with our primary fuel supplier." The response from operations came back immediately, crackling with static and barely controlled panic. "Hamilton, what exactly did you do down there? We're showing fuel service interruptions at gates B44 through B52, and the ramp supervisor is reporting that all Titan Energy trucks are departing the field simultaneously. The pilots on 4 different flights are asking for explanations that nobody up here can provide." Maya lowered the satellite phone and looked at Derek with an expression that contained no anger or satisfaction, just a calm recognition of cause and effect, action and consequence, the natural result of treating people badly when those people happen to have the power to respond in ways that went far beyond filing complaints or posting negative reviews on social media platforms that airline executives never read anyway. The air conditioning in the terminal began to falter as the aircraft parked at the gates started shutting down their auxiliary power units to conserve fuel, and the temperature in the gate area began to rise as the greenhouse effect of the massive glass windows started to overwhelm the building's climate control systems, creating a physical manifestation of the pressure that was building throughout Horizon Airways' operation as the reality of a fuel embargo began to cascade through every aspect of their business model. Passengers throughout the gate area were beginning to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Their conversations shifting from complaints about delayed departures to speculation about what could possibly cause an entire fuel supplier to simply stop providing services to an airline in the middle of normal operations. And phones began to appear as people started recording what was clearly becoming a significant event that would be worth sharing with their social networks and possibly with news organizations that specialized in aviation industry drama. Catherine Reed arrived at Gate B47 like a corporate firefighter responding to a 5-alarm blaze, her high heels clicking against the polished floor with the rapid staccato rhythm of someone who was moving faster than dignity normally allowed, but who had priorities that went far beyond maintaining appearances when the entire company was on the verge of operational collapse. As Horizon Airways Vice President of Operations, Catherine had dealt with her share of crises: weather delays, mechanical failures, crew scheduling disasters. But nothing in her 20-year career had prepared her for the possibility that their primary fuel supplier would simply stop providing services because a gate agent and duty manager had insulted the wrong passengers. Catherine's navy blue suit was impeccable despite her hurried journey from the executive offices, and her silver hair was pulled back in a style that suggested both competence and authority, though the slight sheen of perspiration on her forehead betrayed the stress that was building throughout Horizon Airways' leadership team as reports of grounded aircraft and canceled flights began flooding in from airports across the western United States, where Titan Energy Solutions provided the fuel that kept their entire operation airborne. "Mr. Hamilton," Catherine said as she approached the counter, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was far more dangerous than shouting or dramatic gestures. "Please explain to me exactly how a routine passenger service interaction has resulted in the complete suspension of fuel services at 3 of our major hub airports, and what appears to be the beginning of a full-scale corporate crisis that could destroy this company's reputation and financial stability." Derek's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, his brain apparently unable to process the magnitude of his situation quickly enough to generate words that might somehow explain how his decision to void 2 boarding passes had triggered what was clearly becoming the aviation equivalent of a nuclear strike against his employer's business model. Maya stepped forward and handed Catherine the satellite phone, which was still connected to her father's office, and Catherine accepted the device with the resigned expression of someone who knew that she was about to have one of the most important conversations of her professional career, even though she was completely unprepared for the power dynamic that was about to unfold. "Mr. Williams," Catherine said into the phone, her voice professionally calm despite the chaos that was erupting around her, as more fuel trucks departed the airport and more flights appeared on the departure board, with the dreaded delayed status that indicated operational problems beyond the normal scope of airline management. "This is Catherine Reed, Vice President of Operations for Horizon Airways, and I want to apologize for whatever miscommunication has occurred here and work with you to resolve this situation as quickly as possible." Victor Williams's response carried no warmth or diplomatic courtesy, just the kind of business-focused directness that billionaires used when they were done pretending that normal social conventions applied to situations where their family members had been disrespected by people who should have known better. Ms. Reed Victor's voice emerged from the satellite phone with crystal clarity. "Your employee, Mr. Hamilton, accused my daughters of federal crimes, canceled their legally purchased tickets, and treated them like suspected terrorists, rather than the loyal customers they've been for the past 5 years, all because their appearance didn't match his personal expectations for first-class passengers, and now he's experiencing the consequences of choosing prejudice over professionalism." Catherine felt her stomach drop as she began to understand the true scope of the disaster that Derek's actions had created, because discrimination lawsuits were expensive and embarrassing. But fuel embargoes were extinction-level events that could ground an entire airline permanently if they couldn't be resolved quickly and completely. "Sir, I understand your frustration, and I want to assure you that we take these allegations very seriously," Catherine began. But Victor Williams interrupted her before she could launch into the standard corporate crisis management script that might work with ordinary customers, but was completely inadequate when dealing with someone who had the power to shut down airports with a single phone call. "Ms. Reed, I'm not interested in assurances or investigations or any of the other bureaucratic responses that airlines typically use to avoid taking responsibility for their employees' actions," Victor stated with the kind of finality that closed off entire avenues of discussion before they could even begin. "I'm interested in immediate concrete actions that demonstrate Horizon Airways' commitment to treating all passengers with the respect and dignity they deserve, regardless of their age, race, or clothing choices." Catherine looked around the gate area and saw dozens of passengers watching the conversation with the kind of intense focus that people reserved for entertainment that was both dramatic and free. Their phones held at angles that suggested they were recording every word and facial expression for later analysis and broader distribution across social media platforms that could amplify any corporate misstep into a viral disaster that would follow the company for years to come. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Williams?" Catherine asked, though she already suspected that whatever Victor Williams had in mind would be far more expensive and humiliating than anything Horizon Airways' legal department would normally recommend accepting. First, Victor's voice carried through the satellite phone with the authority of someone reading terms that were non-negotiable. Immediate termination of Mr. Hamilton and Mrs. Morrison for violation of federal anti-discrimination laws and breach of their employment contracts, with no severance, no pension benefits, and notation in their permanent employment records that will prevent them from working in customer service positions anywhere in the transportation industry. Linda Morrison made a small choking sound as she realized that her career, her pension, her entire future was being dissolved in real time by a man she had never met, whose daughters she had treated like criminals, because she couldn't imagine that young black women might legitimately belong in the first-class cabin she had been guarding like a racist dragon for more than 2 decades. Derek's face went completely white as he understood that he wasn't just losing his job, he was being blacklisted from an entire industry. His management aspirations crumbling like ancient paper as the consequences of his prejudice reached forward to destroy not just his present position, but any possibility of future employment in aviation, hospitality, or any other field where customer service skills were required. Second, Victor continued, his voice carrying across the gate area like a judge delivering a sentence, public acknowledgement from Horizon Airways that discrimination occurred, that your company's training and oversight failed to prevent it, and that you're implementing immediate changes to ensure it never happens again, published in major newspapers and broadcast on national television within 48 hours. Catherine closed her eyes briefly as she calculated the legal and financial implications of a public admission of liability that would open Horizon Airways to lawsuits from every passenger who had ever been treated badly by their staff. But she also understood that refusing Victor Williams's demands would result in the complete shutdown of their West Coast operations and the eventual bankruptcy of the entire company. The termination happened with the swift, brutal efficiency of a corporate execution, witnessed by hundreds of passengers whose phones captured every moment of professional destruction, as Catherine Reed transformed from crisis manager to executioner, delivering the kind of justice that was rarely seen in the sanitized world of airport customer service, where bad behavior was usually rewarded with additional training rather than actual consequences. Derek Hamilton and Linda Morrison. Catherine announced, her voice carrying across the gate area with the formal tone of someone reading a legal document that would reshape multiple lives in the space of a few sentences. Effective immediately. Your employment with Horizon Airways is terminated for cause specifically violation of company anti-discrimination policies and federal civil rights regulations, with forfeiture of all benefits, severance, and pension rights as stipulated in your employment contracts under the Gross Misconduct Clause. Linda's face crumpled like paper being crushed in an angry fist, 24 years of loyal service evaporating in a moment of racist panic that had seemed so natural and justified just minutes earlier, but now appeared as the career-ending mistake that would define the rest of her life. Her Service Excellence Award pinned to her chest with such pride now felt like a weight dragging her down into a future where she would be unemployable, unmarketable, and unemployed, trying to explain to prospective employers why her career had ended in such public disgrace. "You can't do this to me," Linda whispered, her voice breaking as the reality of her situation penetrated the wall of denial she had been building around herself since Victor Williams's voice first emerged from Maya's satellite phone. But Catherine's expression remained as cold and professional as a surgeon's scalpel, because sometimes healing required cutting away diseased tissue before it could spread and infect the entire organization. Derek's reaction was more explosive, his management training kicking in as he tried to assert authority in a situation where he had none, his voice rising to a pitch that suggested panic was beginning to override what little professional composure he had left. "This is wrongful termination," Derek shouted, his words carrying across the terminal and adding to the growing viral video content that would follow him for the rest of his career. "I was following standard security procedures, and I demand to speak with someone from legal before you take any further action." "Security will escort you from the premises immediately," Catherine replied without emotion, gesturing toward the 2 airport police officers who had materialized at her shoulder like corporate angels of justice. Their presence transforming Derek and Linda from employees with rights and protections into trespassers who needed to be removed before their continued presence could cause additional damage to the company's already compromised reputation. The badge removal ceremony was conducted with the solemnity of a military court-martial, with Linda's hands shaking so badly that she could barely unclip the identification card that had given her access to secure areas, authority over passenger boarding, and the sense of purpose that had sustained her through decades of thankless work, dealing with demanding travelers and corporate restructuring that had steadily reduced her benefits while increasing her responsibilities. Derek threw his badge on the floor with the petulant gesture of someone who still hadn't fully processed how completely his life had changed in the space of 20 minutes. The plastic identification card skittering across the polished terminal floor like a hockey puck, its magnetic strip and embedded chips rendered worthless by the electronic systems that had already deleted his access codes and removed his name from every database that confirmed his employment with Horizon Airways. The crowd watched with the mixture of horror and fascination that accompanied public shamings, some passengers clearly uncomfortable with the severity of the punishment, while others nodded with satisfaction at seeing discrimination finally receive consequences that matched its impact, but all of them understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the normally consequence-free world of airline customer service. Maya and Zara stood quietly throughout the termination process, their faces showing no triumph or vindication, just the weary satisfaction of people who had seen justice served after years of accepting humiliation as the price of traveling, while Black, their dignity intact despite everything that had been said and done to diminish their worth and question their right to occupy spaces they had legitimately purchased access to. The security escort was conducted with professional courtesy that contrasted sharply with the way Derek and Linda had treated the twins just minutes earlier. the officers guiding them toward the exit with the kind of respectful efficiency that should have been applied to every passenger interaction regardless of age, race, or clothing choices, but which had been reserved for people who looked like they belonged in the exclusive spaces where privilege was purchased, along with airline tickets. The private jet that descended from the cloudless Los Angeles sky was a Gulfstream G700, its midnight blue fuselage bearing the subtle Titan Energy Solutions logo in silver script that caught the sunlight and reflected it like molten metal as the aircraft touched down on runway 25L with the whisper-quiet confidence of engineering that cost more than most people's houses and represented a level of wealth that made first-class commercial tickets seem like convenience store purchases. Catherine Reed found herself in the unprecedented position of personally escorting passengers to a private aircraft. Her role transformed from corporate executive to apologetic chauffeur as she led Maya and Zara through the terminal corridors that connected the public gates to the private aviation facilities, where the truly wealthy bypassed the indignities of commercial air travel entirely and moved through the world in climate-controlled comfort that made their own first-class cabins seem cramped and common by comparison. The walk from Gate B47 to the private aviation ramp was a study in contrasts with Catherine's expensive heels clicking against floors that grew progressively more exclusive as they moved away from the public areas where passengers lined up for security screenings and boarding announcements past the airline lounges where premium credit cards bought access to free drinks and Wi-Fi through restricted corridors where only airline employees and VIP passengers were permitted, and finally on to the tarmac where private jets waited like mechanical racehorses, their engines warm and ready to launch their passengers toward destinations that didn't appear on any commercial airline schedule. The heat that rose from the concrete tarmac was substantial enough to distort the air into shimmering waves that made the surrounding aircraft look like mirages, and the sound of jet engines at various stages of startup and shutdown created a mechanical symphony that spoke of power speed and the kind of freedom that came with owning rather than merely purchasing transportation that could move across continents as easily as most people crossed city streets. Maya paused at the base of the Gulfstream's stairs, turning back to face Catherine with an expression that carried no anger or resentment, just the kind of calm assessment that comes from understanding exactly how power works and what happens when it shifts suddenly from one group of people to another, leaving former authority figures scrambling to adapt to new realities that they had never imagined possible. Ms. Reed, Maya said, her voice carrying easily over the ambient noise of airport operations. I want you to understand that this wasn't about getting revenge on your employees or destroying your company, because we have better things to do with our time than punish people for being ignorant and prejudiced. But sometimes consequences are the only teacher that actually changes behavior. Catherine nodded her professional composure, masking the calculation that was happening behind her eyes, as she tried to determine how much additional damage control would be required to prevent this incident from cascading into a full-scale corporate disaster that could affect stock prices, federal regulatory attention, and the kind of industry reputation that took decades to build but could be destroyed in a single viral video. We want you to know that Derek and Linda weren't unique. Zara added her words, carrying the weight of years of similar experiences with airline employees who had looked at her and her sister and seen problems rather than customers' threats, rather than human beings deserving of basic respect and professional courtesy. They were just following patterns that your company and this entire industry has allowed to exist for decades. And if you're serious about change, you need to look at the system that created them rather than just removing the symptoms. The twins climbed the stairs to their father's aircraft with the fluid grace of people who had been boarding private jets since childhood, their movement suggesting the kind of ease with luxury that comes from growing up in environments where private aviation five-star hotels and exclusive access were simply normal parts of existence, rather than special treats that required saving money and planning months in advance to experience. Catherine watched the Gulfstream taxi toward the runway with the kind of mixed emotions that come from witnessing both justice and overwhelming power. Understanding that she had just seen her company's customer service failures exposed and corrected by people whose wealth gave them options that most passengers would never have, including the ability to shut down airport operations until their dignity was properly recognized and respected. The contrast between the grounded Horizon Airways aircraft and the smoothly departing private jet was visible to everyone in the terminal, a physical representation of the difference between dependence and independence, between being subject to other people's prejudices and having the power to respond to those prejudices with consequences that went far beyond filing complaints or posting negative reviews on travel websites that airline executives rarely read. As the Gulfstream climbed steeply into the afternoon sky, banking toward the east, with the kind of performance that commercial aircraft could never match. The fuel trucks began returning to LAX's gates, their drivers receiving radio communications that had originated from Titan Energy Solutions' corporate headquarters and traveled through encrypted channels to restore normal operations, now that Victor Williams's point had been made with the kind of clarity that would be remembered throughout the aviation industry for years to come. 3 months later, Derek Hamilton stood in the unemployment office in Van Nuys holding a clipboard with paperwork that documented his transition from airline management to jobless pariah, the questions about his previous employment requiring explanations that made potential employers' expressions shift from interest to polite rejection as soon as they understood the circumstances surrounding his departure from Horizon Airways, and the viral video that had made his face recognizable to anyone who spent time on social media or watched aviation industry news. The PRISM database that tracked airline industry employment had been updated with Derek's termination details, creating a permanent digital scarlet letter that followed his job applications like a shadow. Because the aviation industry was smaller and more interconnected than most people realized, and news of discrimination incidents traveled faster than aircraft at cruising altitude, especially when those incidents had been recorded, uploaded and viewed by millions of people who shared them with commentary that ranged from satisfaction at seeing justice served to detailed analysis of institutional bias in transportation industries. Derek's apartment in Burbank had been downsized twice since his termination. His corporate management salary replaced by unemployment benefits that covered basic necessities, but none of the lifestyle elements that had defined his pre-Maya and Zara existence, forcing him to sell his car, cancel his gym membership, and move to neighborhoods where he couldn't afford to maintain the appearance of success that had been so important to his sense of identity and professional advancement. Linda Morrison's situation was even more dire because at 58 years old, with no college degree and a 24-year employment history that had ended in public disgrace, she was essentially unemployable in any industry that required customer interaction or background checks that would reveal why her airline career had terminated so abruptly and completely, leaving her with part-time work at a convenience store where she earned in a month what she had previously made in a week. The pension that Linda had counted on for her retirement had been voided by her termination for cause, and the legal fees she had accumulated trying to fight the employment decision had consumed what little savings she had managed to accumulate over her decades of service, leaving her facing the prospect of working until she was physically unable to continue because she no longer had any financial safety net to support her through the final years of her life. The federal investigation that followed the LAX incident had expanded beyond Horizon Airways to encompass industry-wide examination of passenger treatment protocols, with the Department of Transportation establishing new monitoring systems that tracked discrimination complaints across all major airlines and required quarterly reporting that made it impossible for companies to bury problems the way they had been doing for decades without oversight or consequences. Horizon Airways had implemented what they called the Williams Protocol, a comprehensive anti-bias training program that required all customer-facing employees to complete 40 hours of education about unconscious prejudice, de-escalation techniques, and proper procedures for handling passengers who didn't conform to traditional expectations of what first-class travelers should look like, with termination as the automatic consequence for any violation that could be documented through security cameras or passenger recordings. The financial cost to Horizon Airways extended far beyond Derek and Linda's salaries, encompassing legal settlements, federal fines, stock price decline, and the operational expenses associated with the 3-hour fuel embargo that had grounded 47 aircraft and stranded nearly 12,000 passengers across the western United States, creating a cascading series of delays and cancellations that had rippled through the airline's schedule for more than a week after normal fuel service was restored. Maya and Zara had donated their legal settlement to the Sojourner Truth Aviation Academy, a program that provided flight training scholarships for young women from underrepresented communities, transforming their negative experience into an opportunity for other people who might face similar barriers when trying to pursue careers in aviation industries where diversity had historically been limited by economic factors and cultural assumptions about who belonged in cockpits and control towers. The twins had also testified before a congressional subcommittee about their experience, their composed and articulate presentation providing lawmakers with a clear example of how discrimination operated in practice and why federal oversight was necessary to ensure that civil rights protections were enforced consistently across transportation industries where passengers had limited alternatives and substantial power imbalances made informal resolution of disputes difficult or impossible. 2 years after the incident at LAX, Maya and Zara Williams sat in the front row of their graduation ceremony at USC's Viterbi School of Engineering. Both having completed accelerated aerospace engineering programs that had prepared them for careers in the aviation industry, they had inadvertently helped reform through their refusal to accept discrimination as the normal cost of traveling while Black in America. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were entering an industry that had once tried to exclude them, but now welcomed their expertise and perspectives as valuable assets in creating more inclusive and equitable transportation systems. Their father, Victor Williams, watched from the audience with the kind of pride that comes from seeing children transform trauma into purpose, prejudice into progress, and personal pain into public benefit. Understanding that Maya and Zara had chosen to engage with the aviation industry not as a form of revenge, but as an opportunity to ensure that future generations of travelers would never experience the humiliation and discrimination that had marked their own journey through LAX's terminal 2 summers earlier. The documentary that had been produced about their experience, titled "Grounded: A Story of Dignity and Justice," had won a Student Academy Award and been distributed to aviation training programs across the United States, where it was used to educate airport workers, airline employees, and customer service representatives about the real-world impact of unconscious bias and the importance of treating every passenger with the respect and professionalism they deserved, regardless of their appearance, age, or apparent social status. Maya had specialized in aircraft fuel systems during her engineering studies, choosing to focus on the technical aspects of the infrastructure that her father's company controlled, while Zara had concentrated on aviation safety systems, both of them understanding that their unique perspective as passengers who had experienced discrimination could help them design better protocols and procedures that would protect future travelers from similar treatment, while also improving operational efficiency for airlines and airports. The scholarship program they had established with their legal settlement money had grown beyond their initial expectations, supported by donations from other passengers who had experienced discrimination, airline employees who wanted to contribute to positive change and aviation industry, executives who recognized that diversity and inclusion weren't just moral imperatives but also business advantages that could improve customer service, reduce legal liability, and enhance corporate reputations in an increasingly connected world where viral videos could transform local incidents into global accountability moments. Victor Williams had used the attention generated by his daughter's experience to launch broader initiatives within Titan Energy Solutions, implementing supplier diversity programs that prioritized working with minority-owned businesses, establishing mentorship opportunities for underrepresented students interested in energy industry careers, and creating internal oversight systems that monitored all customer interactions for potential bias or discrimination that could damage business relationships and community partnerships. The twins had also become sought-after speakers at industry conferences, their presentations focusing not on the discrimination they had experienced, but on the systemic changes that were needed to prevent similar incidents from occurring. Their message, emphasizing that effective diversity and inclusion required more than training programs and policy statements. It required cultural transformation that made respectful treatment of all customers a core business value rather than an optional courtesy. Maya and Zara's relationship had deepened through their shared experience of public scrutiny and personal growth. Their bond strengthened by the knowledge that they had faced down institutional prejudice and emerged not just victorious, but transformed their individual identities, expanded beyond their roles as Victor Williams's daughters to include their own achievements as engineers, advocates, and leaders who were helping to reshape an industry that had once tried to exclude them. The trauma of that morning at LAX had been processed through therapy, family support, and the satisfaction of seeing concrete changes implemented throughout the aviation industry. But Maya and Zara also carried with them the understanding that their privilege had enabled them to respond to discrimination in ways that weren't available to most people, and they had committed themselves to using that privilege responsibly to create opportunities for others who faced similar barriers. The ripple effects of the LAX incident had spread throughout the aviation industry with the speed and persistence of seismic waves, creating changes in corporate policies, training procedures, and accountability systems that transformed how airlines, airports, and related businesses approached customer service interactions with passengers who didn't conform to traditional expectations of what air travelers should look like or how they should behave when asserting their legitimate rights to respectful treatment. Horizon Airways had become an unexpected leader in anti-discrimination training, their comprehensive Williams protocol being adopted by competitors who recognized that preventing similar incidents was far less expensive than dealing with their consequences, especially in an era when passenger recordings could turn routine customer service failures into viral videos that generated federal investigations, stock price volatility, and long-term reputation damage that persisted long after the initial controversy had faded from public attention. The Federal Aviation Administration had implemented new reporting requirements that tracked discrimination complaints across all commercial airlines, creating transparent accountability systems that allowed passengers' advocacy groups and government oversight agencies to identify patterns of problematic behavior and target enforcement actions toward companies that consistently failed to provide equitable treatment to travelers from all backgrounds and economic circumstances. Airport management companies had redesigned their customer service training programs to include scenario-based education that specifically addressed interactions with passengers whose appearance might not match traditional expectations for first-class travelers, business-class passengers, or VIP lounge members, using video simulations and role-playing exercises that helped employees recognize and overcome their unconscious biases before those prejudices could manifest in discriminatory behavior that violated federal civil rights laws and company policies. The changes hadn't been limited to passenger-facing operations, extending throughout airline corporate cultures to include hiring practices, promotion decisions, and supplier relationships that prioritize diversity and inclusion as business advantages rather than compliance obligations, with many companies discovering that their efforts to prevent discrimination actually improved overall customer satisfaction, employee morale, and operational efficiency across all aspects of their business models. Professional associations representing airline employees, airport workers, and aviation industry contractors had established new ethical standards that explicitly prohibited discriminatory behavior and required members to complete continuing education courses about unconscious bias, cultural competency, and respectful customer service techniques that were designed to ensure that every passenger received the same level of professionalism regardless of their personal characteristics or apparent social status. The legal precedent established by the twins' case had been cited in dozens of subsequent discrimination lawsuits, creating a body of case law that made it clear that airlines could be held financially responsible not just for individual incidents of bias, but for patterns of discriminatory behavior that suggested inadequate training, supervision, or accountability systems that failed to protect passengers' civil rights and dignity while traveling on commercial aircraft. Maya and Zara had been invited to serve on industry advisory committees that developed best practices for inclusive customer service, their perspectives as both discrimination victims and aerospace engineering students providing unique insights into how technical systems could be designed to support, rather than undermine, equitable treatment of all passengers, while their public speaking engagements had educated thousands of airline employees about the real-world impact of prejudice and the business benefits of respectful professional customer service. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 2 years after their confrontation with Derek Hamilton and Linda Morrison, Maya and Zara Williams walked through the same corridors of LAX Terminal 6 where their lives had been forever changed by a few moments of prejudice that had escalated into a nationwide conversation about dignity, respect, and the power of privilege to create consequences for discrimination that too often went unpunished in the normal operations of American business and society. They were returning from London, where Maya had completed a summer internship with Rolls-Royce's aerospace division, and Zara had finished a research project with British Airways Safety Systems Group, both of them having chosen to engage with the aviation industry that had once rejected them as a way of ensuring that their traumatic experience would contribute to positive changes that would protect future generations of travelers from similar humiliation and prejudice. The Horizon Airways gate area at B-47 looked exactly the same, with the same velvet ropes separating first-class passengers from economy travelers and the same basic layout that had witnessed their confrontation with airline employees who had looked at them and seen problems rather than people. But the atmosphere felt completely different, charged with the kind of respectful professionalism that should have been present from the beginning, but had required a very public lesson in consequences to establish as the normal standard of customer service. The gate agent who processed their boarding passes was a young black woman whose nameplate read Jennifer K. Customer Service Excellence, and she greeted them with the kind of warm professionalism that made it clear that their appearance, age, and casual clothing were completely irrelevant to their right to respectful treatment as paying passengers who deserved the same courtesy that would be extended to any other first-class travelers, regardless of their personal characteristics or apparent social status. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Williams," Jennifer said with genuine warmth as she scanned their boarding passes and confirmed their seat assignments, her interaction demonstrating the kind of inclusive customer service that had become standard practice at Horizon Airways following the implementation of their comprehensive anti-bias training program and accountability systems that made discrimination a career-ending mistake rather than a minor policy violation that could be overlooked or ignored by management. Maya and Zara boarded the aircraft with the same quiet confidence they had carried 2 years earlier. But now their presence in first-class seats generated no suspicious looks, challenging questions, or demands for additional identification from flight attendants who had been trained to recognize that respectful treatment of all passengers was not just a moral obligation, but a core business requirement that protected both individual dignity and corporate reputation in an interconnected world where discriminatory behavior could be recorded, shared, and amplified across social media platforms that reached millions of people instantly. During the flight to New York, where they would be speaking at an aviation industry conference about diversity and inclusion in transportation careers, Maya and Zara reflected on how their traumatic experience had been transformed into an opportunity to create positive change that extended far beyond their own lives, to touch the experiences of countless other travelers who would benefit from the policies, training programs, and accountability systems that had been implemented throughout the industry in response to their refusal to accept discrimination as the normal price of traveling while Black. The settlement money they had donated to scholarship programs had already supported 43 students from underrepresented communities who were pursuing aviation careers, while the federal investigation their experience had triggered had resulted in policy changes at more than 60 airlines and airports across the United States, creating ripple effects that would protect travelers from discrimination for generations to come, while also improving overall customer service standards that benefited passengers from all backgrounds and economic circumstances. As their aircraft climbed into the clear blue sky above Los Angeles, Maya and Zara understood that their story represented more than just individual justice or personal vindication. It demonstrated the power of privilege used responsibly. The importance of standing up for dignity even when doing so required significant emotional effort, and the possibility of transforming moments of hatred into opportunities for healing education and positive change that could reshape entire industries and protect countless other people from experiencing the humiliation they had endured at LAX Terminal 6. The view from their first-class window showed the sprawling landscape of Southern California, stretching toward the horizon, millions of individual lives connected by invisible threads of shared humanity that transcended the artificial barriers of race, class, and prejudice that some people tried to maintain through acts of discrimination that ultimately revealed more about their own limitations than about the worth or dignity of the people they were attempting to diminish, exclude, or humiliate. Today, the Williams Aviation Diversity Initiative has funded over 200 scholarships for underrepresented pilots. Maya and Zara, now commercial aviation students, continue advocating for equality in the skies. The incident that could have broken them instead forged them into leaders who refuse to let others experience what they endured. Derek Hamilton works construction, struggling with debt from legal settlements. Linda Morrison found work at a small-town diner, her pension gone forever. Their choices that summer morning changed not just their own futures, but created a precedent that protects travelers nationwide. Sometimes the price of prejudice is everything you thought you owned. The next time you travel, remember that respect isn't earned by ticket class or appearance, it's owed to every human being. Maya and Zara's father had the power to ground flights, but his daughters had something more powerful: the courage to demand their dignity when the world tried to take it away.